It's 9:10. This is Del Aware. It is Tuesday, July 7th. I'm Peter MacArthur. Appreciate you being with us this morning. You know, so many businesses, so many governments for that matter, find themselves in uncharted waters right now. Their revenue bases kind of ripped apart by the effects of the coronavirus pandemic. For many, it's already too late. Their doors are closed and closed for good. But for many others whose fate's kind of hanging in the balance, what comes next? What is the path forward? Well, we decided to enroll the help of Kirsten McGregor. You may well know who she is already. She knows a lot of people in Delaware. She's an economic recovery expert. Joining us to talk a little bit about this situation at hand. Kirsten, good morning. Thanks for the time.
Oh, great. Thanks for having me.
You bet. Why don't we start by doing this? Explain a little bit about your professional experiences and your professional journey that puts you where you are now as an economic recovery expert.
Sure. So, I've been an economic development consultant for most of my career. I did have a little stint there as deputy director of the Delaware Economic Development Office before it became the Delaware Prosperity Partnership now. But I worked for the U.S. Department of Commerce as an economic development specialist, and that's where I had my first real experience with recovery. That was Hurricane Sandy. So they had mission assigned me with what they do in the government, the federal government, to FEMA. And I ran the economic recovery for New Jersey with FEMA. And that was the start of being a subject matter expert in economic recovery. So most recently, though, I've been, and I still am working there remotely because of COVID, the U.S. Virgin Islands with Hurricane Irma and Maria with their recovery. So a lot of different events, but those are the big ones.
Yeah.
I guess another one is I'm senior policy advisor to President Obama's Hurricane Sandy Task Force, so that's a big one.
Kirsten, so as you're going about these jobs like people do, you're absorbing kind of what's going on, getting an impression of how things work, how things don't work, and ultimately you're doing some of your own work now with your own firm. Yeah,
so March was pretty quiet. I think, for everybody, things kind of stopped. And I got scared just like everybody. Mm-hmm. And then out of nowhere, I started getting phone calls from friends and colleagues trying to pick my brain about, how should we do this? And I realized these people had never dealt with disasters before. They were in areas that weren't disaster prone. And so they weren't familiar with how supplemental funding worked, how the Small Business Administration worked for funding for businesses. And then I just started posting some things on LinkedIn, and it just kind of snowballed where people from all over the world actually were reaching out to me. So I've already hired 5 people, 5 great people on my team. It was just me before. So, things got moving fast. But there's a lot of things I just noticed, with not just with businesses, but governments. Early on, I was surprised, and a lot of it, I think, had to do with the fact that they didn't have a level of comfort or familiarity with how you deal with disasters.
Does this straight up qualify as disaster economic recovery, what we're dealing with now? Do the same kind of checks and balances hold true from your perspective?
Absolutely. And in fact, and people don't realize this, but FEMA does have pandemics listed under their disaster recovery planning guide. I mean, it is considered one of the things that they look at. But I do think this is a little different, mainly because it's how it's sort of rolled out. And quite frankly, it's been a little bit unique here in the United States compared to other countries. The fact that we've been in what I would call the disruption phase, which would be like a hurricane going on and on. This is the pandemic, is the disruption, and the lockdowns are the disruption. We are going through the response phase where where FEMA goes in and the Army Corps goes in immediately following a disaster to basically stabilize the area. That's response. So we're I would call the reopening strategies and phases that are going on a response mode, while the disruption or disaster, if I'm calling it disruption, is going on simultaneously. So that's different. That also has a lot of different ways of how we look at it as consultants, because the data is all thrown off because the disruption is still going on while response is going on. So that's a little different.
If you're just joining us, so we're talking with economic recovery expert Kirsten McGregor. Now, you've broken this down into a number of steps, which is a great idea because, frankly, it's so complex just in its being. It is uncharted waters for a lot of places. So Where, in your opinion, do you think businesses and governments, I mean, where do they need to start? If they're still afloat on any measure, what do they need to start thinking about and doing?
Well, I've noticed that a switch, and it's not everywhere. I'm seeing a lot of people step up to the plate and embracing the uncertainty. I know that it's hard, but to switch that mindset, I guess because I work in this world, it was pretty easy for me to pivot and embrace uncertainty and know things are always going to change and never go the way you think they are. And every day things are going to change with policy and funding, and as we've seen just with the testing and in cases, everything changes. So you just have to basically lean in and embrace that uncertainty and know that you have to change your strategies. But I have seen a lot of people embrace that. But I think that if you haven't done that already, and it's not something that's easy, but changing your mindset, because the people who follow you, whether that's if you're a government leader or an agency leader or a business owner and leader, that your people they're desperate for communication right now, and as I think we've all seen, they're going to go wherever they can get it. So it better be from somebody who knows what they're talking about.
Absolutely.
And that's what we've seen, yeah.
I love some of the points you make in just one of the articles that you've penned about this that I caught wind of. One is something that alludes to what you're just talking to. Be responsive, not reactive. And I think, boy, that initial knee-jerk is all about reaction, and you just see the damage it can do in a situation like this.
Yeah, and again, I think a lot of it has to do with how a leader embraces all of this, and is grounded and is adaptive and authentic, because people feel that. And even if they have to do things they don't want to do, again, if it's constituents or your employees, or your staff, your team, that they see what you're doing. So that's what I've been encouraging people to do. But then we start getting into tactical things, right, that you can do, like building the support system and building the capacity in place. That this is more government oriented, but it definitely needs public-private sector, private involvement, because businesses drive the economy. So if we have a task force or an office of pandemic or disaster recovery. A lot of places that are disaster prone have a chief resilience or chief recovery officer. A lot of these frameworks and designs are already in place in cities and places around the world. So we don't really need to reinvent the wheel, but we do need to have dedicated staff to look at recovery, because I think a lot of people, that this is something too, this reopening phase, this is not recovery. The recovery is going to go on for several years. And yes, are they interrelated? Absolutely. But you need to make sure that when you're looking at recovery, that you have a dedicated staff. And, and I'm not telling myself, but there's a lot of people who do similar things to what I do, that we've done this before and we can come in and help. So I think that knowing that recovery phase that's going to be going on for years, the planning, the strategies, all the federal funding, the capacity just isn't there right now with states and counties and cities to deal with the magnitude of money too.
Kirsten, how important is it to retain your mission, or do you need to be more flexible? Does a mission can it be a bit of a stranglehold at a situation like this? And should businesses be looking at other avenues to go down to recover economically?
Yeah. I think you do need to have a mission and be mission-driven so that everybody has that message about the direction you're going, but you need to be flexible. Even with my own team, I may drive them nuts, but you need to know that if you're going down a road and it's not working out for a number of reasons that are all unknown. We've seen things happen that we didn't think would happen even after COVID, right? So, yes, you do need to be flexible and know that all that time you put into the strategy and mission that you had in place, it's not lost. You just have to go a different direction. And I've seen that with the businesses. I've even personally encountered that the ones who haven't been able to adapt, they're not going to do so well in the long term. So, again, I can see it's in the business owner's mindset. You can already see how it trickles down to how the actual business practice gets implemented. You
talk about the timing of this and how poor it has been for tourism, hospitality, restaurant industries, and what are generally prime seasons for them here in Delaware. Do they need to go about things more aggressively? Or, because they're a harder hit industry, does that set them up in a different way when it comes to trying to recover? Yeah, and again, I think that it is heartbreaking. One of the things that
it's tourism and hospitality are places that weren't even hard hit, and out west where they didn't even have, or Hawaii, for example, or U.S. Virgin Islands, they didn't get hard hit by COVID, but they were hard hit because they're tourism reliant industry geographies. So that's interesting from that perspective. But recovery again is long term. So when businesses are thinking about things just like governments, they do need to think about the reopening strategies and how to comply to keep everybody safe and so on and so forth. Again, that's a response mode to basically stabilize the area. But if they want to start looking at the long term, when they start strategizing with their new business plans for the long term, adapting to this, yes, they need to start thinking about innovative ways of designing their business strategies. So a lot of groups need to rely and lean into their industry, their national industry organizations. Some small, we call them micro businesses, like myself, with 5, 10 employees. Go to the Small Business Development Center. There are several resources available to help you think this through, especially if you're a doctor or a dentist or you have a hair salon. You aren't necessarily used to thinking this way, but there are resources out there outside of the ones that we've all been talking about with PPP and loans and unemployment and so on and so forth. There's a lot of resources that are already existing, and there's people out there ready to help with the state and the federal government.
Kirsten, there's been a little talk about the potential of a second wave, and we've referred to this situation as kind of disaster recovery, right? If that second wave comes through in the fall, does the template hold true, or is it like more of an all bets are off scenario with that double hit kind of a thing?
No, and one of the things I've said is that what disasters do is they basically rip off a Band-Aid, off a wound that hasn't been dealt with and needed stitches and surgery, and it needs to be dealt with right now. So it doesn't take much to hurt the economy or any given part of a disaster, whether it's pandemic or not. Remember, there was an earthquake in Puerto Rico shortly after COVID. We've had a number of social issues happen that impact. So this just makes it that we have existing vulnerabilities that become highlighted, and if we don't deal with them as a community, as a government, as businesses, that's going to be a problem. But we also need to think about business continuity. People need to have it in their head. Again, they do think about this in disaster-prone areas, but have business continuity plans in place. Think about disaster preparedness. Have these plans in place, because it's not just about a second wave. Anything could happen. And the fact that we don't think about that here, and a lot of places, I don't want to point out Delaware, most places don't think this way. But we need to start strategizing and thinking anything could happen. And now that we're so vulnerable with the pandemic, it could take a power outage for a couple of days.
Yeah.
It doesn't take much anymore to have a big impact. Yeah.
You mentioned the importance of resources, and let's say that someone wanted to explore what a firm like yours had to offer to them. What can you do to someone who comes in looking for direction exactly?
So, we primarily deal with economic development organizations, state territories, of course, and cities and counties. But I've also found a lot of nonprofits and chambers actually have been reaching out to me.
I bet.
So, yeah, I think what they've been concerned about is their funding. So I've been directing them towards different funding sources, particularly the government agencies and nonprofit 501c3s to the Economic Development Administration. But they're also, depending on what they're looking at, there are several different funding sources available, not only with the CARES Act. Of course, there's $2 trillion with the CARES Act, but there's also other resources that people didn't necessarily think about because they weren't in this mode before. So that's another thing where we've been trying to help some groups. And then once they're able to get some funding, that's where we can help with long range strategic plans. We can help with governance plans. It's called comprehensive economic development strategies, which incorporate resilience. That's another thing that we do, where we look at hazard mitigation plans that FEMA mandates, and then the Department of Commerce has they call them comprehensive economic development strategies. Aligning all the plans, another thing that you'll find is that a lot of these agencies all have plans and they don't talk to each other. So every group is doing a different plan and they're not aligning. So that's another thing we help with. So, and I think the other thing is helping with capacity, because as we transition to recovery, communities are finding they just don't have the skill set, so we can help train people to learn more about recovery and how to move forward, but also help build that capacity so they can do it on their own.
Yeah. If someone not listening